I wanted to call the 4 o'clock study session of the Palm Springs Planning Commission to order. Can I have a roll call, please?
Certainly. Commissioner Irvin?
Present.
Commissioner Hirschbein?
Present.
Commissioner Lewin?
Present.
Commissioner Song?
Present.
Vice Chair Marusi?
Here.
Chair Wermick?
Here.
We have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Before we go to public comment, the director has an announcement which may be of interest to the people who have just joined us.
Madam Chair, we received notice at 1:45 p.m. this afternoon that the applicant for item number 1 on your study session, Transwestern Development, for the 1.4 million square foot fulfillment center has requested to withdraw their application. So with that, we will not be hearing the item this afternoon. The applicant has indicated that they would like to do additional outreach before the item is heard. So again, the application for the fulfillment center has been withdrawn by the applicant. We will not be discussing that item on the agenda today. So with that, that's the only change to the agenda, Madam Chair.
Thank you. This is a time for public comment, and each speaker has 3 minutes for public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak?
Ma'am,
Yes.
this is Steve Grasha. Although I am elected director of the Mission Springs Water District, where this applicant that pulled his item would have been under consideration. I wanted to just, since we're all here, I wanted to mention that I thought it would be appropriate as a condition of approval should the application come back before this planning commission and I not be able to be present at that time. I would just like to suggest, and this is not an official request on behalf of the district, but myself just happened to be available today, and as a private citizen would ask that this planning commission, the city of Palm Springs, add as a condition of approval that the applicant be required to attach his new project to any future sewage treatment facility that we have currently on the books and likely under construction prior to the time that this facility would be built. I understand that this project will be, if completed, the largest fulfillment center in the world, 1,400,000 square feet. And I stand to be corrected on that, but I believe my research shows that that is the case. That's a lot of truck traffic. As you may know, and up the street at I-10 in Indian, we have I understand, the largest taxpayer in the region, all on septic with their pilot truck center. It's a concern to those of us that are concerned with clean drinking water that we protect that asset at all costs. And that means that any facility like this be forced to connect to the sewer treatment facilities that are either available or coming available down the road. So with that, I thank you very much for your time and look forward to participating as this project moves forward. Thank you.
Can I just ask you one question? You said protect that asset. Are you referring to the aquifer?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who wishes to give public testimony? Mr. Davis?
Hi, this is Peter Davies. I'm here in my capacity as a resident, not as a professional. And I have submitted a notice of objection in a letter form email to the Planning Commission as well. And I'd like that to stand as record in objection to this for a number of reasons, as I've outlined in the letter to you. One, that we should really be first and foremost leading this effort to sustain our community and be environmentally forward-leaning. This is also a very beautiful scenic gateway into the Coachella Valley and to Los Angeles, vice versa, either going in east-west or west-east direction. And we've seen what's happened in Moreno Valley, where such a terrible precedent has been set to build this kind of infrastructure along a freeway that would really be a visual blight and, I believe, an environmental blight on our community. So I stand firmly in objection to this being approved. It is also not a land use that is approved in this general plan. And there are better places that we could have a transit accessible facility like this further east in the Coachella Valley or elsewhere. But this is certainly not something that as a resident of Palm Springs, I would be supporting, and I'll be rallying with other organizations in the Valley and Palm Springs to object in a much more forceful manner in future meetings. But thank you very much for all your hard work, and I really appreciate you guys supporting the community as you do, but a firm objection on my behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who is here to testify? And if anyone has just joined us, we want to let you know that the first item on our agenda, which is the 1,004,000 square foot fulfillment center, has been withdrawn by the applicant. There being no other public testimony.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to call one person who had requested to speak via telephone. So if you don't mind, I can call that individual
Certainly.
now.
Hello.
Hi, Robert McCann.
Yes, this is him.
Hi, I'm calling from the Planning Commission meeting. We received your message that you would like to speak to the Planning Commission. If you would still like to do so, you'll have 3 minutes and you may begin now.
I think the reason that I was going to speak was against the first agenda on your item, or first item on your agenda, which has been withdrawn.
Correct. Do you still wish to provide any additional comments?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it. And then I haven't received any other messages at this time, Madam Chair. If there's anyone else who wishes to speak, now would be the appropriate time to unmute your microphone.
Okay, there's also nobody who's identified that in the chat. The public hearing is now closed. Thank you so much for your testimony and your attendance. I'm going to go to, since the first item has been withdrawn, our second item is discussion on changes to the architectural review process. And can we have a staff report, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the Commission. If you'll give me just a moment, I would like to share my screen and begin the PowerPoint. Okay. So our other discussion item on the study session today is relative to changes to the architectural review process. As we have discussed in the past, this originated from a discussion at the City Council level back in January of 2020, where staff was directed to proceed with a discussion of revisions to our architectural review process. With that, they gave us some key goals that they wanted us to look at. Number one was relative to consider reversing the Architectural Advisory Committee and Planning Commission review process. Secondly, they wanted us to look at limiting the number of hearings, as we often have multiple hearings of the Architectural Advisory Committee and Planning Commission relative to architectural review items. And then third, they wanted us to look at streamlining our application processes. So those were some of the key goals of the City Council in directing staff to begin this work. As you are aware, we did appoint a subcommittee to study the issue consisting of Chair Wermuck, Commissioner Song, and then Mr. Jakeway from the Architectural Advisory Committee. Questions arose at our discussion at the last meeting is why consider revisions to our review process? What was the council's concerns? There's a number of concerns that have come up, and not only from the council, but in terms of the administration of the process. We've heard issues from our Architectural Advisory Committee members that there's a certain difficulty for them in carrying out their responsibilities as the first step in the review process when perhaps the use or the site plan for the project hasn't been approved yet. Excuse me, just a minute. One of the other concerns that has arisen is the fact that there's an overlap in the duties between the Planning Commission and the Architectural Review Committee as it leads to the, as it applies to the architectural review process. So for example, AAC sometimes gives direction to an applicant about a design issue that then the Planning Commission will have a different opinion. And so the applicant is kind of stuck going back and forth between the direction of the AAC and the direction of the Planning Commission. And so that's another one of the issues that has arisen that council hears about on occasion. And then the third issue that comes up from time to time is by having the Architectural Advisory Committee first, that's usually the public's first option or first available time to review a project. And so many times when they attend an AAC meeting, they're giving their input on a project that really isn't the AAC's jurisdiction. It really belongs to the Planning Commission. For example, on the expansion of the Parker Hotel project, we had between 30 and 40 representatives of the neighborhood come to the AAC meetings talking about things such as traffic impacts and other items that really are under the purview of the Planning Commission and not the AAC. And so unfortunately, you know, the body who needed to hear those comments wasn't the one who was doing it. It was the AAC instead. And so for those reasons, talking about reversing the project or reversing the process may be helpful as we look at our architectural review process. The subcommittee began to study the issue last summer. And as part of that, we looked at the ordinances of other cities in the Coachella Valley, as well as a number of cities across California, and reviewed their architectural review processes and looked at what the best practices were. We also looked at the information available from the American Planning Association in terms of architectural review. I've included some of that information in the backup materials for your packet. Didn't want to go over all of that today in our study session. If you have any specific questions, I'd be more than happy to answer that. But one of the critical things that we looked at in reviewing those ordinances is what would address the concerns of City Council in terms of streamlining processes while still maintaining a rigorous architectural review process, which is critical for a community such as ours, which prides itself on its architectural character. So we really looked at those two factors. And in doing so, there was the City of Santa Monica, which has a rather simple process to go through, but one we think is certainly one to be modeled after and one that we can look at. And so what you'll see as I go through the presentation today is modeled in a certain part after the City of Santa Monica's process. One of the other cities that we looked at, Santa Barbara, as many of you are aware, has also a very rigorous architectural review process. However, it doesn't meet the council's other goal in terms of streamlining processes, as it's a rather difficult process to get through and even understand. They thankfully have put together a flow chart in terms of how their process works, which I included in your packet. But again, Santa Monica seemed to have the best model for us in terms of providing a review that's relatively simple in terms of the number of steps, but still has the level of detail necessary for an adequate review process. In looking at other cities, there's a couple of things that we learned. And I may have mentioned this before, that Palm Springs is unique in that we don't have a separate site plan approval process, which other cities have. Most cities have what's called either a plot plan review or a site plan review that is handled by the Planning Commission, where you look at things such as conformance to development standards, such as setbacks, height limits, placement of the building on the site, use, compliance with the general plan, things like that. Here in the city of Palm Springs, we've merged that into our architectural review process. And to a certain degree, that's why some of the issues that I mentioned earlier result, is that there is that overlap in duties between what planning commissions typically do and what an architectural review board will do. Another thing that we learned is many of the other jurisdictions employ a pre-submittal review process with staff before an applicant submits their applications. In certain cities, that staff member will be someone who has architectural training. And so what they will do is they will take in a schematic application from an applicant, review it for conformance to development standards, but also do an architectural critique based on that city's architectural standards. In addition, they'll also go over a checklist with the applicant in terms of required submittal materials. And what we found from that process is it typically results in a better application package. And when you have a better application package, that typically means that applicants will get through the process more quickly because the boards, Planning Commission, Architectural Review Board, have adequate materials in order to be able to make decisions on projects. And so that's another key thing that we found in doing the research. The other thing is that most other cities have architectural review as a discrete process that is typically separate from site plan review, and also in certain cities only applies to specific areas of the city or specific development types. And so that's just another indication of, or another item where some cities conduct architectural review a little bit differently than we do here in the city of Palm Springs, where our architectural review primarily applies citywide with certain exceptions. In terms of our current process, I'd like to just compare what our process is now with what we are proposing in terms of changes to the process. So in terms of our current process for architectural review, step one is the formal submittal, where an applicant will submit an application package to planning staff. We will then take that in, review it, prepare a report. The second step in the process is the Architectural Advisory Committee reviews it for conformance to our architectural review criteria. Step three is the Planning Commission. They review the application, not only for conformance to our architectural review criteria, but also the zoning standards, general plan, et cetera. In certain cases, there's a step four where certain application types require approval by City Council. And so that's whenever an architectural review item is joined with either a general plan amendment or a change of zone application or a planned development district. Those are the types of applications that City Council must approve. And so that's a step four that doesn't apply in all situations, but only in those specific situations. What we are proposing is, before I get into that, as I had mentioned, one of the issues that we have is that sometimes this process is lengthened when there are comments from either AAC or Planning Commission that results in the applicant having to redesign a project. So even though our process is fairly simple with up to 4 steps, sometimes by going through the redesign process, that adds other steps to the process and length to the process. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to address through revisions to our architectural review process. So moving on to what we are proposing, you'll look at this and say, but Flynn, that seems to be more steps than what we've already got. Let me explain it. So step one is actually before an applicant submits their application, we're proposing that they have a pre-submittal conference with staff. And what we would do at that stage is, just like other cities do, review the initial submittal for conformance to development standards, address any issues in terms of waivers or variances that may be needed. Secondly, we would have staff review the project for conformance to our architectural review criteria and make suggestions or direct the applicant to make changes as may be necessary. And then third, we would go over a checklist of required submittal items. So things like as having a grading plan or sections through the site, showing additional context where that may be necessary. We would do that then, so that upon step 2, where the applicant is submitting their application, they would have a more complete application and one that may address our criteria more specifically and hopefully smooth the process going forward. Step 3 in the process would be the Planning Commission taking action on a site development permit. I'll get into the specifics of what Planning Commission will be reviewing as part of that, but Planning Commission would then approve the site development permit. If there was an associated application that required City Council approval, that would be the next step in the process. And then the end of the process, once the site plan has been approved, Architectural Advisory Committee would then review the architectural details. And so Architectural Advisory Committee would be the final step in the process. So that's what we are proposing in terms of revisions to the process. As I had mentioned, a pre-submittal conference is one of the things that we think would be critical for enhanced performance in this process. So again, staff would sit down and go over the site plan and the architecture of the proposed project, offer critique and comments, and give the applicant a checklist with the intent that this will improve the quality of our submissions. And so that's one of the reasons why we think this would be necessary. One of the things I found is that applicants tend to be fine with spending more time up front in the process. So prior to application submittal, if they can get through the next steps more quickly. So that's what that's intended to do. Just a moment. As I had discussed, we would be splitting the application that we currently have in Palm Springs into 2 parts. The first part would be the site development permit, which would be reviewed by the Planning Commission. And that's where Planning Commission would review the use, the layout of the site in terms of the building placement, conformance to setback requirements, where the parking is, how things circulate on the site, where the open space is, landscape buffer areas. This would also be where we address CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. So any environmental impacts would be addressed by the Planning Commission as part of the site development permit. The second part of the process would be the architectural review application, and that would be the responsibility of the AAC. And so once the site plan is set by the Planning Commission, AAC would then review the architectural details, the colors and materials, the landscaping, the lighting, signage placement, etc. One of the things that we have discussed as the subcommittee is improving the criteria for reviewing applications. And so I'd like to go through what criteria you all as the Planning Commission will be using to review the site development permit, and then the criteria that AAC will be using to review architectural applications. And what we've tried to do is work with the very subjective criteria that we've got in place now and to make it a little bit more specific. So I'll go through first the things that the Planning Commission would be reviewing as your criteria for a site development permit. So number 1 is conformance to the general plan in terms of the land use, in terms of the density that's established by the general plan, and any floor area ratio that's established by the general plan. Next, you would be looking at, is the project in conformance with zoning relative to its use, and what impact that use may have on adjacent sites. You would also review if the project is in conformance to development standards. And just so you're aware, when I say development standards, that's kind of a catch-all term, meaning you look at the setbacks, you look at the height limit, You look at the lot coverage, you look at the parking, open space where it's required, the technical requirements of each zone district and whether or not the project complies with those. The next criterion is relative to assessing the height and massing of the project for compatibility with its context with the buildings on adjacent sites. You would also look at building placement as being compatible with adjacent sites in terms of its distance from the street or from adjacent property lines. Next, you'd be looking at conformance to issues relative to traffic. So trip generation, based on the use, how many trips will it generate? Is the street network sufficient to carry it? You would also be looking at driveway locations or the alignment of streets and how that fits in with the existing grid pattern of the city. Another thing that you would be looking at under the site development permit is on-site circulation. So how vehicles circulate on the site, if there's any drive-throughs, what is the stacking room? You'd also look at pedestrian circulation. How do pedestrians get from the public sidewalk to the front door of the building? Are the sidewalks protected from traffic lanes, et cetera? Another thing you'd look at is the required landscape areas or open space, adequacy of utilities to serve the site. As I had mentioned, the environmental evaluation or CEQA evaluation. And then finally, one of the general criterion that we use in most situations, are there any health, safety, or welfare impacts, which isn't covered by the other criteria that we have. And so those are the things that the Planning Commission would be reviewing as part of a site development permit. And that would need to be approved first before we moved on to this next stage, which is architectural review. And so these are the things that the AAC would then be reviewing. So keep in mind that once the Planning Commission approves the site plan is set. And so it keeps your duties separate from those of the AAC. And so the AAC is going to be looking at things such as, is there a consistent architectural treatment on all sides of the buildings? If there's any accessory structures such as carports or accessory buildings, is the architecture of those structures consistent with the principal buildings? You'll look at the composition of facade elements, fenestration, which is just a fancy word for placement of doors and windows. Looking at materials, are they appropriate with the adjacent buildings? Or in the case of hillside houses, are the materials appropriate for a hillside location? Same thing with the color scheme. Another thing that we have added as a criterion is looking at the solar orientation of buildings. How are they addressing shading of windows and openings and things like that? Something that we don't really look at with much degree in terms of our criteria right now. They would also look at the landscape materials, make sure that they're consistent with the water efficient landscape ordinance. Look at shade on the site in terms of shading of sidewalks, pedestrian facilities, parking lot shading, looking at lighting and whether or not it conforms to the code, sign placement either on the building or any freestanding signage, screening of mechanical equipment and service areas. And then finally, is it consistent with any adopted design standards? So for example, Desert Palisades has its own adopted design standards. The Miralon development has its own adopted design standards. Ascena has design standards. One of the things I'm going to talk about is the possibility of adopting objective design standards as part of our code. And so that last criterion is relative to conformance to any adopted design standards we might have. So those are the things that the AAC would be reviewing as their part of the process. So I had the question at our last discussion, how would the process work, and maybe go through a couple of examples of different types of applications, just showing how they would go through the steps in the process. So for this example, let's assume that we're working with a commercial building in a commercial zone, and it's one that has a drive-through. So it could be like the Starbucks Raising Cane's chicken place that we saw. That would be an example of how this might go through the process. So again, step one is the pre-submittal conference with staff. We would look at development standards. We would offer a critique on conformance to our architectural criteria. and then give the applicant a checklist, a submittal checklist of all the drawings that they need to submit as part of their application. The next step would be that they would then make their formal submittal. So they'd submit an architectural review application, the site development permit application, and because they have a drive-through, they would also submit a conditional use permit application. So we would review that for completeness, make sure they have all the items on the checklist. We would circulate it to the other departments for their comments and conditions, and then prepare the staff report. The third step in the process is Planning Commission would then review the site development permit application and go through all the criteria that I had just mentioned previously in terms of the use, conformance to development standards, general plan, etc. At that stage, Planning Commission would also approve the conditional use permit for the drive-through. So you'd be approving both the site plan and the conditional use permit. As part of that, one of the things that the subcommittee thought was important is that the Planning Commission have the ability to offer comments to the AAC on architectural elements. So for example, you might say that, the materials on the two buildings don't quite match. The AAC should review that for consistency. And so as part of that process, you would also be able to forward comments to the AAC as part of your review of the project. Step 4 of the process would then be AAC reviewing the architectural review application. And again, they would be working with the site plan that the Planning Commission had approved and be focusing on the architectural details, the landscape materials, signage, lighting, etc. And so that's how it would work for a standard commercial project. In looking at another type of project, let's look at a single family residence in a hillside area. As part of our process in looking at how we might streamline reviews, what we're proposing to you is that for a hillside review of a single family residence, that the AAC would be really the only body that needs to review those applications. And so what we're proposing is, just as with the other applications, there would be a pre-submittal conference with staff. So we have an opportunity to review the site plan, look at the colors and materials that are proposed for the residents, how do they fit in with the hillside area, look at conformance to design standards, for example, in Desert Palisades. And from there, we would give the applicant a checklist. They would make their formal submittal. And then the Architectural Advisory Committee would review and approve the architectural review application. So in this case, no site development plan application would be required. It would just be an architectural review application that the AAC would review and approve. And so what we're proposing is to eliminate one of the current steps out of the process. Instead of having Planning Commission also review it, it would just be limited to the AAC reviewing and approving hillside houses. We also had the question at our last discussion about how would this revised process apply to development within specific plans. We have 4 specific plan areas that we administer. The College Park specific plan, which is up on the north end of town, Desert Highland Gateway area. We have the Desert Palisades specific plan, which is specific to that development. We have the downtown specific plan, which covers the GRIP properties on both sides of Palm Canyon. And then we also have the Section 14 specific plan. In terms of how this new process would apply, it depends on the language that's in the specific plan about review processes. So for example, for the College Park specific plan, it doesn't really discuss any specific type of process other than referring back to the city's zoning code. So development in the College Park specific plan would go through whatever approval process is required under our zoning code. So no changes would be necessary there. However, with the Desert Palisades specific plan, the downtown specific plan, and Section 14 specific plan, they each have a discussion about the order of the process. So Desert Palisades and Section 14 both say that projects shall go to AAC first and then to Planning Commission. Downtown specific plan says they should go to AAC first. 15 days later, they go to Planning Commission. And then after that, they go to City Council. So in order to apply these changes to those specific plans, we would need to amend the specific plans to reference the new process. We also have the option of just keeping things the way they are for those specific plan areas. And so that's one area where I would like some feedback from the Planning Commission as we get to the discussion point of the agenda is what we would like to do there. Let me just go through an example quickly on the downtown specific plan in terms of what the process is now and looking at if we were to modify it, what it would look like then. The current process is the applicant makes their formal submittal. We route it, we prepare a staff report. AAC then reviews the application, followed by the Planning Commission, and then City Council is required to review and approve the project. If we were to make changes based on what is being proposed here today, what that would look like is, as with the other projects we discussed, pre-submittal conference would occur first with staff. We would go through the development standards, architecture, and provide a checklist. Then they would formally submit the application. Planning Commission would review the site plan, conformance to development standards, general plan, specific plan. Then City Council would review and approve the site development permit. And then finally, it would get advanced to the AAC to review the architecture of the building. And so if we were to apply this to the downtown specific plan, that is what the process would look like. Let me discuss briefly some other changes that we're proposing that would assist in streamlining processes. First is relative to signage. There are two application types that typically require review by AAC and Planning Commission. The first is sign programs, which is a multi-tenant building. They'll have multiple signs on the building. So currently we have AAC and Planning Commission review those types of applications. What we're proposing is to shorten that process so that AAC would be able to have final action on a sign program. And so that way that would cut one step out of the process. With sign districts, what we're proposing is rather than City Council being the one who approves sign districts, is having the Planning Commission be the body that approves sign districts. Sign districts apply to multiple properties. So for example, that would be the Miralon development. It has a sign district because it has signs in multiple locations across the 300-acre site. We also have talked about sign districts for the downtown area, but haven't gone through the process in actually approving those yet. But again, what we're proposing is rather than having the City Council approve those, it would be more appropriate to have the Planning Commission approve those. So those are two of the changes relative to signage that would help to streamline the process. The other thing that we looked at is the conditional use permit process. To be quite honest, our section of the code that deals with conditional use permits is a little bit outdated. It has a list of approximately 20 conditional use types that require review by the Planning Commission and approval from the City Council. And again, that list is pretty much outdated because those specific uses are typically addressed elsewhere in the code, or they're no longer, they're out of date, basically. For example, if you wanted to have a beehive in your backyard, you would have to file a conditional use permit, have the Planning Commission review it, and then it would have to be approved by the City Council. That's something that seems way out of date in this day and age and not worth the $8,500 cost of a conditional use permit. Another thing, it requires airports to have conditional use permit approval. I'm assuming that was developed prior to the zoning of the airport. I don't anticipate that we'll have any other airports in town. And so that's another part of the conditional use permit section of the code that is no longer applicable. However, there are basically 5 items in that list that would be appropriate to keep as conditional use permits. But rather than having them go to Planning Commission and City Council, I think it would be appropriate just to have the Planning Commission do final approval on those types of conditional use permits. And that would include cell towers, utility installations such as the battery facilities that we see coming online now, private educational institutions, government facilities, and then social service providers such as Well in the Desert. So those are 5 conditional use permits that used to require both Planning Commission and City Council. What I'm proposing is just to have Planning Commission as the final authority on those types. And so those are the changes we are proposing there to help streamline processes. I provided a chart for you in your backup materials, which goes through all of the process changes that we're proposing, identifying those in red. And we can go through those in detail as part of our discussion if you'd like to do that a little bit later on in the study session. One of the other questions that you all raised at the last meeting was, how are these changes intended to make the application process quicker? How is it going to streamline processes? So what we're proposing would help with the following in terms of eliminating duplicate reviews where it may not be necessary. So for example, on the sign programs, having the AAC approve those helps to eliminate a step and shortens the time period. Same thing with architectural reviews of single family houses in hillside areas or on major thoroughfares. The second way that I see that it can speed the process, as I've mentioned, is the use of a pre-submittal conference. By identifying issues up front and trying to get those corrected, making sure that we have complete application packages for the AAC and Planning Commission to review, I think will help on the back end of the process when we're going through the public meeting phase in shortening that time period so that we don't have to do multiple reviews of the AAC and Planning Commission to get a project approved, because you'll have all the materials that you need to really concentrate and make a decision and have all of the information that you need to do that. And then the third way that I think this will speed the process is by eliminating the overlap of responsibilities. So those are really the 3 things that I think will assist in shortening the process and how we might achieve the goals of the City Council through those changes. There's some other considerations that I want to put out there for you just so that you're aware of them. The Palm Springs Architectural Alliance, which is a private group here in town, has approached me about adopting objective design standards, looking at our design review criteria. I think that's something that could also help us in shortening the process. As I've mentioned before, right now as it stands, our architectural review criteria is fairly subjective. And so applicants don't really know what they're shooting for. We don't have specifics in terms of, what's the color palette that we're looking for? What's the material palette that we're looking for? What are we looking for in terms of massing or proportions or things like that? And so I think we really need to think about, as part 2 of this process, the development of objective design standards. And as I'd mentioned, PSAA would like to be involved in that. I'd recommend that we have representatives of the Architectural Advisory Committee and Planning Commission as part of a subcommittee that reviews and develops architectural criteria at some point in the future here. The second consideration that I think we need to address is relative to staffing. As I've talked throughout this presentation, a pre-submittal conference is something that will dramatically help the architectural review process. The key part of that is having a staff member who has an architectural background and who can administer that process. So that would be someone who would be able to sit down with applicants, review the architectural details, and offer suggestions in terms of how they might comply with our criteria. And so that's another component that I think we need to discuss with the City Council. Since the budgeting and staffing lies with the City Council, that's something they'll need to look at. But if we use this pre-submittal conference, I think that's something that needs to be addressed there. So those, again, are future considerations that City Council needs to look at and something that I'd recommend that we address as part of this overall process. So with that, that concludes my presentation to you. And Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you in terms of how you'd like to proceed with questions and comments, and we'll go from there.
Hi, can you hear, can you hear me? What I'd like to do is first go over the proposed review process and have comments and discussions and any issues that stand out to people. The second item would be a general discussion about specific plans and talk about the downtown specific plan and what kind of changes we would like to see in that. So I'm going to open it up to the commission on the general direction. Have people read the actual changes to the ordinance? Oops. I'm going to try and get you back in a gallery view if I can do that.
Let me stop sharing the screen, Madam Chair.
Okay, great. Welcome to those of you who are sitting in with us. So I wanted to go through the general thrust of the specific plan with putting the planning commission first. I'd also like Flynn to talk about the points in time when we will do something slightly different. But can I start with, is there anyone who would like to comment? If not, I will call on you.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Lewin.
Commissioner Lewin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really like what you've done here. This makes a ton of sense to me to have two different bodies that don't have overlapping responsibilities. I think it's well thought out. The only question I had was where City Council would make an approval and then the AAC would weigh in. And I wonder if City Council is comfortable with approving something without having seen the architecture that they're approving. But everything else that you've done here makes a ton of sense to me, and I'm very impressed. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and address that. That was one of the concerns of the subcommittee as well, is even though we're talking about two application types, a site development plan application and an architectural review application, the subcommittee felt it was important that all of the architectural materials be provided as part of the site plan review so that Planning Commission and City Council are able to see the architectural treatment, colors, and materials as well. Even though they aren't taking action on those items, at least they need to see the overall entire project as it's proposed. And so that's how we would intend to do that, is they would get the same materials that AAC will eventually see.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yes.
So,
Well,
yeah,
is Commissioner Lewin done? Because I wanted to let him finish his comments first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I'm done, and I appreciate the answer from Flynn. Thank you.
so, yeah, I was thinking about that same thing, Flynn. So what gets submitted to us, Planning Commission, is the same documentation that gets submitted, this is a question, gets submitted to AAC?
Yeah, that's what the subcommittee felt was important, is that both of you see the same materials.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Okay.
And if I can answer Commissioner Lewin's question, I think it would solve a problem that gets created if, for example, the Planning Commission turns down a project, but it then the City Council then approves it. It still allows for an architectural review of what actually gets approved. And there would be two examples of that. One would have been the market, the Tower Market in North Palm Springs, where because we had turned it down, we hadn't dealt with architectural issues. The council actually took that on in that instance. The second of those was the Virgin Site condo project, where they actually didn't take that on and there was no review of materials. So in this instance, they would see what we're seeing. If it was appealed to them, they could, or they pulled it up, they could comment on it in the same way we had. but there would actually be a body that followed through on it. So we liked the order that, I think we liked the order that Flynn put this in. It was his construct, but we felt comfortable with what Flynn had proposed. Commissioner Maruzzi, I see a hand tentatively raised.
It was actually, yes. I really like the pre-submittal conference with staff. I think that's a really excellent step that we lack right now. I don't know how long it's going to take before there's a budget to hire a planner that has the required architectural background. So what I was thinking, perhaps in the interim, the chair of the AAC could fulfill that function in the pre-submittal conference. And then at some point when there's a staff person that has those qualifications, the AAC chair wouldn't be required anymore. At least there would be somebody in there at the beginning who understands. And then we have to talk about the design standards and what the schedule is for the second phase. But I think that would help. So that's number one. Should I just keep going or should we just stop there?
You have the floor.
Okay,
So
I
I don't know if you want answers to those as you raise them or if you want to just go through your list.
I'd actually like to do one at a time. So what do people think about the idea of having an AAC, the AAC chair step in until someone is qualified to do that from staff?
We asked that question at our last meeting, and apparently it would require Mr. Jaquay's full-time presence. And that seemed like it was unworkable. We do have 2 architects on our staff, don't we, Flynn?
Well, 1.5. Mr. Lyon has worked as an architect and is certified. I have architectural degrees, but I don't have the time to actually sit down with applicants and do that. In terms of the chair of the AAC, that would be an incredible commitment. He would need to be available during the workday. It could be multiple hours each day in terms of meeting with applicants and going through that. How we might solve the problem in the interim is using a consultant to do that review for us. Also, the other thing that we can look at is, because we are in the what I'll call budgeting season right now, the new fiscal year takes place on July the 1st. There is the possibility if City Council were to consider the addition of a position, that could go forward as soon as July 1st. So our timing is good right now in terms of that, but ultimately I think we could look at a consultant as an interim solution.
Mr. Maruzzi still has the floor, and Mr. Lewin will be next.
So, okay, so I understand the problems with having the AAC chair step in at this point, or any point, it seems, at the beginning. And it would be great if the city would hire someone that has additional experience. The second thing I'd like to do is I'd like to go through the example that you gave. You gave 2 examples. One was the commercial building with the drive-through. And that one seems fairly straightforward, but let's start with a simple one like that. And the reason I'm asking for that is because I think there are some additional steps that would pop in. Let's, if we could go through it. Okay. In addition to what you have as in the example.
Okay, so let me pull that back up again.
Okay, so let's use that example that you were talking about earlier, which is the, well, I think you lost it. You had it there for a minute.
Let me go back. There it is.
Yeah. So the pre-submittal conference, would that, the issues that were raised had a lot to do with circulation and placement of the building and all those things. Where would that have been addressed?
So that would be addressed at 2 points in the process. The first is in the pre-submittal conference with staff. That's one of the things that staff would look at, is the circulation and stacking on the site. And then secondly, where the on-site circulation would be approved is under step 3 with the Planning Commission. So you as the Planning Commission would approve the on-site circulation as part of the site plan.
But don't we often request to see the changes implemented in a plan at some point, instead of just saying, well, we'll just rely on, I guess, staff to make sure that they do it the way we find it appropriate. So it seems like we would make our comments about the position of the building and the circulation around the building in this example, but we would never actually see the end result. It would move on then to AAC, and that's it.
It depends on the project. I see this going a couple of different ways. If you all, as the Planning Commission, are proposing revisions to the site plan, you still have the option of continuing the item to your next meeting and giving the applicant the opportunity to make revisions to the site plan. You can also continue to use the subcommittee process that we currently use, where if it's just minor tweaks, then you can have up to 3 Planning Commission members review those changes before it goes forward to the AAC. So you still will have the opportunity, if there's something that you want to see change, you can still bring it back for a second meeting of the Planning Commission.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's look at the downtown specific plan and use the Virgin site as an example, because there were a lot of comments from us and from AAC, and I want to see how that would have worked in this case. I think you're blocking. I might have to move our little pictures over. Here we go. Okay, so we have the pre-submittal conference with staff. In the case of the pre-submittal conference, right off the bat, we have the issue of design standards and the Palm Springs Architectural Alliance and their involvement in helping create those design standards. It would be really important to see how, to find a way to get those standards approved, discussed and approved sooner the better, because we will have additional projects coming forward with downtown. So assuming that not too much was changed in the design after the pre-submittal conference, it goes to Planning Commission. And at that point, if some of us had strong opinions about it not meeting the specific plan or all the issues that we raised, this would be the first time for us to see it. We had issues with the light, the amount of light that was penetrating into the inner courtyard. We had issues about not enough commercial on the ground floor. We had issues about the overall architectural design not being high enough, of great enough standards. I mean, all these things would these still be considered and discussed at step 3?
Yes, correct.
Okay, let's say that we have a lot of comments and concerns. Is that, again, that we continue the item and or set up a subcommittee?
Yep, absolutely.
But that certainly could delay things.
Can I well, it will
Sure.
delay things. This is one of the areas where we want to talk through if we want anything different. There are 2 steps that the director has under this at his purview. One would be a single meeting of the architectural committee to look at the project once and give comments. It could also be a study session with the Planning Commission to look at the project and give comments. So there could be on a high profile situation like this, and I would assume in a high profile situation like this, where it's downtown in a major building, the director would opt in one of those ways to have some look at it and feedback before there's action. So I think, and this is just, and Flynn might want to talk about that too, but I think those steps are probably steps that we want to allow in the downtown specific plan, but possibly at the discretion of the director.
What about, just to jump in with the study session concept, what if it was a study session with Planning Commission and AAC up front, so that for an important project like this, so we could get all the ideas thrown out there, at one time, instead of having to maybe do it multiple times?
Right. I think doing something like that when it's a special building, but again, I think at the discretion of the director, but I think that's something we might want to look at in the downtown. Flynn, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll just say that as the chair has mentioned, we have language in the draft ordinance that still allows for a pre-application in a study session with the Planning Commission for large or complex projects. We also have the option under the AAC process where I can take things to AAC where there may be design issues that we want to resolve up front. So we've reserved that. Let me just talk briefly with Jim Priest, our attorney, in terms of allowing a joint study session of Planning Commission and AAC. I don't know that we necessarily need to draft that into the ordinance itself. I think that we have the authority and the ability to do that right now. But that's a good comment and something that we may want to look at so that we can resolve both site plan issues and architectural issues, perhaps with the same body up front before we go through the formal process.
Excellent. Thank you. I have lots of notes written here, but I think a lot of them have been addressed. So I think I'm finished for now. Thank you.
I believe Commissioner Lewin had asked to speak.
That was an accident on my part. I would, Madam Chair, please defer to other members of the commission.
Okay. Commissioner Hirschbein? And that was the first hand I saw. I don't know if anybody else had made a request.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you to the subcommittee and to staff. This is a lot of work, a lot of thinking. So thank you. And the output's great too. I do have a number of comments and I'll just throw them out there. They're not in any particular order, just kind of how it came to me. But first of all, if staff does hire an architect to provide input on the design packages, I would urge that architect also have somewhat of an urban design background as well. There's no certification for urban designer, but it's somebody is versed in good urban design principles to also help guide the applicant, because a lot of our projects seem to need a lot of help in that regard as well. So that's one comment. In terms of objective design standards, that was kind of my career, as objective design standards in the shopping center industry. And one thing I think as a city, you have to be careful of mandating things like a color and material palette. I would strongly disagree with that. I think it sets up sort of an ossification in a city. I mean, sometimes it works. Santa Barbara certainly has a cohesive look to it and it works, but we're not Santa Barbara. And I don't think having things at that granular of a level allow for creativity and change over time as well. I mean, beige might be in one year and then pink might be in the next year. So what are you going to do? Address colors every few years? I just think getting down to that level of design standard would be a mistake. That's my opinion. I've got a question and a concern by putting AAC at the end of the process. What if AAC turns it down?
That's a good question, and something that Chair Wormuck also brought up in our subcommittee meetings. What we've built into the process is that if AAC denies an architectural review application, it's appealed to the Planning Commission. So it would then be forwarded to the Planning Commission to take action on it. And
so we could either support or turn down their.
Correct. So
okay.
Appeals would come to you.
Sorry?
Appeals would come to you as the Planning Commission.
Okay. Well, thanks for clarifying that. You know, when I first heard some of the terminology being used in previous sessions, I was a bit concerned about site plan development review, because to me that connotes a rather limited review scope. When you list what we're actually reviewing, it expands, but by calling it that, and I don't know what to call it, I'm not going to suggest anything, but to my ears, when you say site development standards, that's what the review is called. you're reviewing a much more limited scope than what you're actually saying we can review. So I would suggest coming up with a broader definition of what that review is called. Let's see. I just wanted to ask committee or staff, we've heard the upside to these proposed changes. What downsides do you see to any of the proposed changes?
Just speaking from a staff perspective, I will say that it takes more work on our part up front on applications.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to be able to dedicate staff time to holding the pre-submittal conferences, doing the checklists. And so that's one of the downsides. But again, we're hoping that it makes up for it in the public meeting part of the process, in that we don't have as many items that get continued from meeting to meeting, which also requires staff work. The other downside that I potentially see is by splitting it into two parts, the site plan and the architecture, it seems a little bit more complex to applicants in terms of having to file two permits, where actually right now we only file one. While we can address that from a cost perspective by making sure that this process doesn't cost any more than it does now, it's still the idea that you're filing two permits. And that's something that we've struggled with as the subcommittee in terms of this process. While it helps to kind of keep the responsibilities separate, it looks like a burden on applicants, even though it's intended to make it a little bit easier for them. And
maybe you call them both the same thing, and one is A and B.
Yeah, and so that's something that we'll look at that with the attorney in terms of how we might simplify that. So, yeah.
And that suggestion came out of the subcommittee as well.
Okay. The other thing I just like to throw out there, and this is more general, council has instructed you to look at ways to expedite the process. And I think you've struck a good balance, but I think you always have to keep in mind that is expediting the process going to lead to approving designs that are less satisfactory? And I think we just got to keep our eye on the prize. Like, what's the goal here? The goal isn't to expedite the process. The goal is to get good design, but how do we do that in an expeditious way? You addressed how redesign would happen. It's similar to now. PDDs, does this process apply to PDDs also?
In terms of the PDD process, we would need to look at that. I think we can apply it to the PDD process as it currently stands, so that, again, Planning Commission is approving the key elements of the PDD, and then AAC is doing the architecture of that. So I don't think it really needs any major changes to the PDD process. Another thing that we already have built into the PDD process is the requirement for a pre-application. And so again, I don't think that does us any disservice by leaving that the way that it is.
Okay, so basically it's yes, it does include the PDD. Yeah. Okay. The same appeals process as now applies to this revised scheme?
It's just a little bit different. For the site development permit that is reviewed by the Planning Commission, if you deny a project, it would be appealed to City Council. So that is basically the same there. With the architectural review, as we had talked about, if AAC denies a project, then the Planning Commission is the appeal. Here's the appeal. So that's the only difference in the process.
Okay. Again, I'm jumping around a little bit, so I'm sorry, I'm kind of going back a little bit. But in terms of site development standards, which is what you showed as far as how you want Planning Commission to review the site development application, it seemed like a checklist. I mean, I know you were trying to get objective about it, but it seemed like, okay, floor area ratio, check. Setback, check. Height, check. I mean, that's kind of staff. To me, that would be something the staff would be able to review if that's all we're looking at. Because we do bring some subjectivity to our reviews now. And I would hate to lose that, because if it is just a checklist, then, you know, you really don't need us. We would be redundant to that process.
So a couple of the criteria speak about context and appropriateness with context. Those are items that really aren't a checklist and tend to be a little bit more subjective. And so those are key things that we want the Planning Commission to review. So the massing of a project, again, that's not necessarily a checklist item, while height and setbacks play into it. That's one of the things that we want you to look at. Placement of the building on the site, you know, just more than does it meet the setbacks, but is it consistent with the other buildings along the street? So there's a couple of the criteria that address more subjective things, but still need to be addressed by the Planning Commission before the Architectural Advisory Committee can really get into the fine details of it. So it's a balance. There are also things such as the use. Are there going to be impacts from the use? We rely on the Planning Commission to look at that, and we'll talk about that more as we look at restaurants in the P-zone in our agenda later today. You all tend to address impacts of use, and is that appropriate? And then the final criterion that we have in terms of general health, safety, and welfare, that's another area that we look to the Planning Commission for guidance on. So I tried to be a little bit more specific with the criteria, so at least applicants know what they're shooting for. But I think that there are still things that require the input of the Planning Commission to make a determination on the appropriateness of the overall project.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that. I only have one more thing, and it kind of dovetails into the thing we just talked about. And when we're asked to review a project, we're asked to make findings. And, you know, is it appropriate? And then there's a whole bunch, 12 different findings. And if there's one or two findings we can't make, then we're allowed to turn the project down. Will we still have that same format? Will findings still play a part of this?
Yeah, your criteria are your findings. So that is the way that you address that. So you still have to make the findings. If it doesn't meet the criteria that we've established, then the Planning Commission can deny the project.
So will that list of findings that you've provided us in the past, will that change?
Yeah, it's being expanded and enhanced.
Is that something that we can see, Flynn?
Well, that's my question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. But as this goes through to next week or 2 weeks from now.
Did I lose Flynn?
Yes. So this list that I went through in terms of the criteria, these are your findings. So for example, if it doesn't conform to the general plan, you can't make the finding, you would deny the project. Same thing with conformance to zoning, height and massing. If it's not compatible with adjacent sites, you can't make the finding, then you would turn the project down. So that's really the list that we're looking at in terms of findings.
So what of those, what findings that we're currently looking at have been eliminated? Because that's quite a bit fewer than what we have now.
So this is the list that we have now. If you can see that on the screen, there's 9 items. And as I had mentioned, it doesn't really go over all of the things that it should. So for example, it doesn't talk anything about the general plan, it doesn't talk about CEQA. So this is the list that we use currently.
Those are the findings that we've been using? Those don't sound familiar to me.
Yeah.
Those are AAC findings.
But again, as I had mentioned, you have a combined site plan architectural review process. And these are the only findings that we have in the code currently. Now, staff does do a review of development standards in conformance to the general plan, but they're not specifically identified as findings here in your zoning code currently. So that's one of the things that we want to improve as part of this process.
So are any of these being eliminated?
Not per se. We've incorporated them into the new findings. Site layout, we're talking about that. Location of structures.
Can you lower that a little?
So for the most part, they are addressed in the criteria that we have either under the site plan review or the architecture review criteria.
Okay. All right. That's all I got. Thank you very much. That was very helpful.
Are there comments, Commissioner Song or Commissioner Irvin? Commissioner Lewin.
Is it me or is it Commissioner Irvin?
I didn't see his hand up, so I don't know if he had comments. Commissioner Irvin, did you have comments? Then I'll have him go first. I'd like everybody to speak if they want to.
I would like to say that this has been something interesting for me. And being the new guy on the block, I kind of want to lean a little bit on the other commissioners. There was a couple of maybe questions that I might have had. It looks like a lot of the questions that I had to ask were asked already. So, but there was something that I seen in there also. And I just wanted to know when it comes to the AAC, I don't know how I can word this, but what makes the AAC so important? I noticed that in the the rotation of the new proposal, so it's a lot of AAC examination going on in the steps. So maybe I can have someone maybe help me a little bit, Flynn, maybe you or Kathy, the significance and the importance of AAC, because for me, it seems like the Planning Commission tends to be a little bit of an afterthought, like it really kind of could not be here. So maybe I'm missing out on something. Can you help me a little along those lines?
Certainly, and maybe I'll go first, and Chair, if you'll excuse me. Just because AAC is at the end of the process, I don't feel it gives them any more importance in the process. I really see Planning Commission as being the critical step in the process, in that you all are approving the use, you're approving the parameters of the project, if you will. AAC is really focused on the details of what plant materials, the colors and materials, the architectural details. Planning Commission is looking at the overall scope of the project and its impact on adjacent properties. So even though AAC is last, I wouldn't say that they're the most important step of the process. It really is Planning Commission's approval of the site development permit that is a critical element in the process. And I don't want to downplay that at all. But you're first, because those are really the issues we need to address first before we can get into the finer details of the architecture. And Chair, you look like you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, exactly the same things. Without the Planning Commission, there's no project. If we don't approve those items, it doesn't go forward. Yet, in some sense, it's a more limited role for the AAC, although a more definite role, because they're not coming in the beginning, opining on the whole project. Yes, it's a go. Yes, we love it. No, it's a disaster. We're turning it, we don't end up with those kinds of comments in the beginning. We have to look at the use, the placement. Does it look appropriate to us? And send the other items along, which some of us on this committee are probably skilled enough to deal with, like what's the materials palette, but others of us, myself included, you would never want to comment on the materials palette. Although I probably would be willing to. So, but it's, I actually think I think it enhances the role of the Planning Commission because it comes first. We actually deal with whether it's going to go or not go. And for me, that's important. I've worked in this process, and when I've seen the biggest confusion here, it sometimes is when we both want to turn something down. We both hate it. We just hate it for different reasons. And there have been a number of projects like that, and then it's harder to resolve those issues. If that makes sense to you.
Yes. And so, and another question. So are we going to have any sort of a trial period with this, or is this, I mean, I know we tried it before, but is this going, if this is approved, is this going to be it going forward?
It is, unless we make any process. What we typically recommend when we adopt a new ordinance, for example, with the historic preservation ordinance, we adopted a brand new ordinance in 2018. City Council asked us to come back in a year and report on the effectiveness of the ordinance. I think we would probably want to do the same thing here if we were to adopt this, is to give it a try for a year, report back to the City Council on the effectiveness, and then if we need to make modifications or tune-ups to the ordinance, we have the opportunity to do that. So we always have the opportunity to modify our ordinances where it makes sense to do so. And I'll tell you, you never get anything right immediately from the start. There's always little things that you need to tweak and improve. And so I'd recommend that we have a 1-year period that we look at it and then report back on the effectiveness.
Okay. And then there's one more other thing. Since we are making an adjustment to the criteria and things like that, is there any way possible, I like to put all my energy and all my effort into reading and making sure that I'm making a sound decision. Is there any way that we can discuss or talk about the time from receiving the packet to making the decision and rendering a decision? Is there any way that we can maybe get those packets sooner to give us more time, especially with items such as the 2 that we had prior that are very important and critical? Is there any way with the zoning, with the different changes and the study sessions and all the things that we're doing, is there any way that we can get those packets sooner to be able to, some of us also have day jobs. So it as well as volunteering our time to this, but I want to be able to make a sound decision and be able to give that energy to reading everything and making sure that everything is correct. And 3 or 4 days is a really short period of time to go through all of these documents and be thorough with the decision.
And
what I'd suggest is we come back to that. It's not actually part of this discussion, but that we take it up in comments later. Are you okay with that? Sure, Charlie, because I don't think it's really part of this discussion.
Sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, yeah, that's an administrative item that we can address separately that wouldn't go into this ordinance per se, but the concerns that you raised, Commissioner Irvin, really show your dedication to what you do with the Planning Commission and all of you as planning commissioners in terms of having to digest our staff reports and the supporting materials and wanting to do an effective job in reviewing and discussing these projects. So we appreciate that and understand your concerns. Just so you're aware, the difficulty that we have is with a limited staff, it's always a challenge for us to get the staff reports finished, the agenda published. we're up against a time clock as well. But what I'm hoping is that the combination of the changes to the process combined with the fact that we're working on a new electronic submittal system that will give us greater abilities than we currently have, that might give us the opportunities to get packets to you sooner. So that's something that we'll investigate. And again, we do appreciate your concerns in that regard. So thank you.
Commissioner Song, did you have questions? I have one or two comments, but I wanted to incorporate yours first.
And Madam Chair, I still wanted to speak after Commissioner.
Oh, I'm sorry. Commissioner Lewin, and then if Commissioner Song would like to speak, and then myself.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to say that I agreed with Commissioner Hirschbein's comment that an objective design standard I don't think is a great idea for our city. And I do remember the days when all signs had to be brown and beige in Palm Springs. And, what sounds good today, I think he used the word ossification, and I think it's not necessary for us to have that in the new ordinance. So I like that comment. Wanted to know from Flynn, if we have a problematic project under the new process where there are circulation issues, there are massing issues, how many times, let's say the applicant brings it back thinking they understood what we wanted, but our sense is they still didn't get it right. How many times can we continue a public hearing until we feel satisfied before it moves forward under the new plan?
So the City Council, as an action at their January 2020 meeting, limited the reviews of Planning Commission and AAC to 2 times. That if by the second set of revisions, the applicant still doesn't have it right, then you as the Planning Commission or the AAC has every right to turn the project down. Because if they still aren't getting it right, then they need to rethink the project. That's really the idea, that sometimes we're just prolonging the pain by continuing them. That doesn't mean that when you send something to subcommittee, that counts as one of the meetings, or if you have a pre-application conference, that doesn't count against the number of meetings. But it gets to be a point where if the project is truly problematic, it doesn't meet the criteria, the applicant isn't making the necessary changes, then the appropriate action is to deny the project. And really what they need to do is go back to the drawing board, so to speak.
Okay, so it's a hard and fast rule. We can continue it one time. We could have a subcommittee meet with them, but by the second return, it's an up or down, yes or no from us.
It's not language that's in the ordinance. I'm not proposing to add it to the ordinance. It's something that exists as a city council policy currently.
So there could be, Flynn, let me ask you this. Could there be a situation where the applicant and the commission feel like we're almost there, but there's a few more details to work out? What would happen then?
If it's at the request of the applicant to continue the item, I think that would be appropriate to do so.
So the applicant could say, I would really like to come back, and we would either say yes or no?
Yeah, you as the Planning Commission ultimately decide.
You could give it to a subcommittee too at that point.
Yeah.
Well, we're at the second meeting at this point is what I'm saying. So, okay. So thank you, Flynn. Two more questions. What happens if it goes all the way, it goes through Planning Commission, it goes through City Council, it goes to the AAC, it gets denied, and the applicant appeals it back to us at the Planning Commission? What if we then deny it? That's a weird process where we've approved something, the City Council has approved something, and now it's come back to us and we say, turns out we agree with the AAC and we're denying it. Is that lawful and okay to do?
Yes, it is, because you're looking at 2 different permits or 2 different applications.
Got it.
Planning Commission has approved the site development permit. When the architectural review comes to you on appeal, it doesn't impact your approval of the site development permit.
Got it. We would be denying the architectural permit.
Correct.
Okay, that makes total sense. Thank you. The final question is, with the pre-submittal concept, which I think is outstanding, the conference with staff, And I feel confident that the council will find the budget to hire an architect because this is a revamping of our process. Will the applicant have to pay a fee at that point so they're not wasting staff's time? Because I'm thinking of this 1.4 million square foot project that was brought forward for a study session. I don't want people to waste staff's time. So when do they pay their fee?
Yeah. What I would propose is that for the pre-submittal conference, there not be a fee associated with that. If someone does a study session with the Planning Commission, for example, a pre-application like we had today with Transwestern, there is a fee for the pre-application, but not the conference with staff. Does that make sense? So if you go before Planning Commission or AAC as part of a pre-application process, there would be a fee associated with that. But the actual meeting with staff, no, I wouldn't propose that we charge a fee for that.
And Flynn, can I just follow up on that a little bit, just to understand why? Because in my mind, they're already taking up your staff time. You're pulling your staff architect and one of your planning people and maybe your engineer. Why wouldn't they be paying for it at that point?
Here's the challenge is that we want applicants to do the pre-submittal conference. We want to encourage or incentivize them to do that because ultimately it works to our benefit. How we pay for that is through the fees for the actual application. So built into the site development permit or the architectural review application would be the understanding that the applicant has spent an hour with staff in a pre-submittal conference. And so we would actually bill that, if you will, through the application fees rather than just billing them separately for the pre-submittal conference.
But, and I'm just trying to understand this fully from your frame of reference. I understand what you're saying there. But if the ordinance requires that they have a pre-submittal conference with staff, the incentive is you can't actually apply for anything unless you do it. So how does the fee deter them from doing it?
So again, because we're doing work up front before someone submits an application, my preference is that we should make staff available to answer questions, address concerns, provide information to the public. I think that's something that we need to do as a public service. And I see the pre-submittal conference as part of that. And the best way to account for staff time is the fact that we will have done that for every application. So we can build that fee into the application. So the applicant is only paying that fee once instead of having to pay two separate fees, once upfront for the pre-submittal and then upon application again. So it's really to be more convenient for the applicant.
Okay, that makes a ton of sense. I understand. And obviously, as we addressed with Commissioner Irvin, these are just laws and rules. And if it turns out somebody's abusing the system and you get 750 cannabis applications in the pre-submittal process, we'll address it at the one-year review. Okay. Thanks so much for making this so clear. Madam Chair, those were my questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Song, did you have questions or comments?
No, I had only one clarification, and I think also to the public that at every meeting, being Planning Commission, being Architectural Review, there is a public hearing. People are allowed to participate, people are allowed to comment. That's why all meetings would be publicly posted. So I think there were some concerns that by having an architectural review or presentation at the very end of this process takes the public participation out of the process, but that is not the case. At every one of these public commission meetings, the public is allowed to make their comments. That's the clarification I wanted to make. Thank you.
Madam Chair, we are at 5:35 right now. We'll need to take about 10 minutes to get set up in council chambers for the regular Planning Commission meeting.
Can we extend this 10 minutes or 15 minutes so that we finish
if you'd
this
like to.
item, since we don't have that full an item going forward, not going to recognize Commissioner Maruzzi yet because I wanted to make a couple of comments. One is that I think people should realize that this is a hybrid. The hybrid piece in this is the talented staff in a pre-submittal conference, doing some of what AAC used to do at the very earliest stage, and that's critical. I would hope that the pre-submittal conference is very early before the applicant ties down a design, so that staff has the ability to have some influence on what I would say, although you can't give a standard for it, looks like a really bad design. Doesn't fit well. I mean, there are issues. That's part of why we want this, is we want better design, and having staff, a talented staff person early on is important, but it's a hybrid. It's not all professional staff, and it's not just all volunteers. The second is that we did include in this the Planning Commission, and I don't know if council will do that, appointing the AAC, because we work most closely with them. We probably have more of a sense of who the talented people are, or what kind of talents we need on that commission. And we have the ability to appoint or not continue. I totally agree with Commissioner Hirschbein about the findings, and I would actually like to see in findings, I'd like to see a little more about the findings so that we don't eliminate findings that allow us discretion where we are allowed discretion to say, I mean, some of the best planning commissioners I've ever seen didn't understand planning and weren't architects, but they knew when something didn't fit the community. And so I want there still to be discretion to do that in the findings. The last is, I just want to say something about the 2-meeting rule. We're trying to streamline it. My experience with this is that it did streamline it. But when we had, and I can almost say we had a corrupt city council, we certainly had an indicted member of the city council. There were times with developers where they would come in and they'd say, just turn us down. We're not going to do anything for you. We're not going to change anything. Just take it. We want to go to city council because they're going to overrule you. And I have some concerns about the 2-meeting. I don't want that in the ordinance, but I have concerns about that because that practice really did result in bad design. So just wanted to throw that out. It was an experience of my early years on the Planning Commission here in this city, and sort of abuses occurred by people feeling like they could just go over us and never have to deal with our comments. So I guess those are mine. I wouldn't pay a fee for pre-submittal, and I'd like it to go early, and I'd like the staff person to have authority when we get to there. And I would be a little worried about too rigid of design guidelines. I know in Asino, where we have design guidelines and we have a committee, a lot of the early things that we had, the general guidelines are still somewhat followed, but the rigid rules got thrown out after 10 years. So, Commissioner Maruzzi, you had comments?
Yeah, just regarding the design. The term design standards, I think, is inappropriate. It's design guidelines. And I don't think that the idea would be to prescribe color and these very specific things. I think what we're talking about here is the Palm Springs Architectural Alliance is a new organization that has some very smart and talented people involved in it. I would like to hear what they have to say. They're working really hard on coming up with some design ideas and guidelines. I like the idea of the city council creating a subcommittee, which would involve us and others, and I'd like to be part of that if possible. But yeah, I don't want to see standards that are hard standards. That's not at all what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is we need to, I'm going to just take the example of the Virgin project, replacement project. It seemed unfair to require, at the very end of the process, if the project had been denied because of architecture, that the overall design was not appropriate for the city and what we expect to have as architecture in this town. That should be right up front. And if we do in this pre-submittal hearing or meeting, somebody talented in those areas as part of staff, and there are some general guidelines that have been put together that try to explain why Palm Springs is unique in terms of our design and why we want to keep those standards high. Maybe we can nip something in the bud early on before they spend a lot of money on plans and renderings and all of these things that then ultimately, either we or the AAC say, well, I'm sorry, but whatever finding we have to make here, this is not going to work here in this town. And the sooner that can happen, the better. So that is what I'm thinking about for design guidelines up front, not saying, oh, you got to do beige. No, I'm not at all interested in that. So this is something that I'd like to continue to talk about if it's going to be an issue. But I think we could, in the second phase it's described here, I think that some good ideas could come out of it, and ultimately they can be rejected. So.
I think we've had enough in the way of comments, but we didn't just get to specific plan comments. So can we finish up this portion? Say we finished up comments in the study session and take up the specific plan issues as the second item of our regular meeting, since we're in both agendas. Or Flynn, do you need those comments?
Yes, I'd like to have those comments so we can follow up during our regular meeting and discuss that point then. Okay,
then I am going to, and you have enough in the way of comments and guidance.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to adjourn our study session, and the meeting, the regular meeting of the Planning Commission will be adjourned until 6 o'clock. At which time we will resume on the same Zoom channel. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.